if everybody finds a seat, just come a little bit closer. It's good for everybody. Then I'd like to begin with our first panel, this high-level panel on the first day of EuroDIG 2019. And I really like to introduce the moderator of the panel, Maarten Botterman. And I think you all know him, but for those who don't, Maarten is in the direction of the ICANN board. And he is an independent advisor and policy and so on policy and society. I'm sorry, this coffee break was too long for me, so I have to adjust to the English again. So you do far more better than I do, and I give the word to you. Good luck with for all of you.
Thank you very much, Marjolein. Thank you, everybody, for being here. As Marjolein said, the closer you are, the better we see you. And it's about interaction. EuroDIG is about interaction. I'm actually moderating this panel together with Emily Taylor from Oxford Information Labs, and very happy to do that. Emily is going to focus on the panel discussion, and I have the honor of keeping the embrace up and beyond that. So what we want to do with you is to take you to 2030. By going to 2030 and sketch a world out there, see how that may look like, what we like about it, and how we can get there. We hope to go beyond the struggles, the ripples, as they say when you're canoeing in a river, of the things that we are faced with today, and really look ahead to the future and what's really important. And for that, we're very happy to have Jonathan Cave and Jaya Baloo to be willing to sketch a little bit of their insight in how that may look like. Jaya Baloo is the Chief Information Security Officer of KPN, the biggest service provider in the Netherlands, and the former telecom when countries still had just one telecom operator. You'll love to hear from her. I've heard you before. It's a big honor to have you here, and she can speak of her feats and really blow you away. So let's get you to do that. Beautiful. And next to her, and first speaker, Jonathan Cave. Jonathan is a policy analyst. I learned to know him at Rand Corporation, and he's been working at the University of Warwick, economics and game theory, excellent combination, and currently connected to the Turing Institute. And from that perspective, he would like to give the first sketch of 2030 and how that looks like. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin. Oh, hey, the microphone works. Okay, well, I'll try to be reasonably informal. What Martin didn't say is that I have a government role. Pay no attention to that. This has got nothing to do with it. And so I want to think about what will happen in 2030. And the basic message I'm going to produce is neither optimistic nor pessimistic. We will have solved a lot of the problems that we worry about today, but I think we will have discovered that those weren't the problems that we should have worried about, or that there'll be new problems that are deeper problems, perhaps, that sit underneath them. Because our tendency always, particularly in policy, but also to a certain extent in civil society, is to try to patch up, preserve, and restore what we think we have. And some of those assumptions, some of those restorations will become insupportable, in part because of the changing roles of power. So I do expect that at the moment there is a sort of artificial tension between concepts of privacy and concepts of cybersecurity. I don't expect that that will be an animating feature of the debate in the future. Now, there are many ways in which it could be resolved. We could simply give up on one of them or the other, or more pragmatically or possibly both of them. But I think that if we think about them both as matters of access to data, access to the power to use data to change things, there isn't really much difference between privacy and security, except in terms of who wishes to control whose access and for what purpose. So I expect that those tensions will be resolved. Oh, hey, I can advance things and so on. I think that a lot of the things that we try to fix, well, a million years ago when the internet was invented, I started a long time ago at RAND in Santa Monica, and we were DARPANET. And we had certain things built into the internet architecture to, for example, negotiate ahead on routes of traffic and to control through social conventions and other things that we worry about now. Flame wars, which would have turned into cyberbullying and things like that. We didn't need to use them because we were a fairly homogeneous culture with homogeneous values, and so they atrophied. Now we're working very hard to restore them, and I think a lot of these things that we try to do through regulation and law and twisting people's arms will have been pushed up the stack. They'll have been dealt with, let's say, technologically or by design, and we will regard these things as having been globally negotiated, and they'll be accepted by all the people who care about them. That's not all the people affected by them, of course, and the things that will be embedded in the common technology will be at the lowest common denominator. And we see this already today because our concept of privacy in Europe seems to be bound up with data protection. And to my view, it isn't that at all. We will expect, however, above this floor, above this common floor, that there will be some states, like the Netherlands today, like the UK in certain ways, that have got out beyond other states. They may have more extensive statements about rights, for example, rights to communication. They'll have a variety of legal tools, and these will be engaged in a kind of ecological structure. Some that we can see even today, we see in the better regulation agenda, where we try to get regulations that don't foreclose change, but sort of support evolution. The complier explain stuff that we were hearing about earlier is an example of this. And we would imagine that if there were a set of common principles, not about acts, but you enforced the rules based on the harm that people suffered, that might be better. Also, we won't have so much commitment to this legislate, then force people to obey it. We'll have certain kinds of sandboxes where the consequences of not having regulations or of having different regulations can be explored before they're tried in the wild. One of the things that we see already today in relation to internet harm, and this is something I do expect to become widespread by 2030, is replacing statutory rules and restrictions with duties of care. So at the moment, the large platform providers, they're not going to go away because economies of connection and economies of scale and provision will continue to be with us, but they may act more like utilities. But because of the subtle nature of the internet, it's not like an electricity network, and it can have impacts on people. Therefore, these people are in a position to do something about it, and I expect them to do it. So one example of a kind of thing that we can see today that we might expect to see in the future is the use of reinforcement learning algorithms to feed content to people based on what they are seen to do. So here's a little thought picture. Somebody goes online and they're interested in self-harm, or they become aware of a community that does self-harming things or wants to control their diet and something like that. The algorithm sees this and it feeds them more of that content. Now, I can think of at least 4 ways somebody might respond to that. They might, as the 13-year-old girl, unfortunately, in England do, be led down a path which leads ultimately to them killing themselves. They might, on the other hand, see where that path leads and be dissuaded from going any further down that path or reflect more deeply behind them as to what the consequences might be. Or it may be that the mere provision of that graphic material traumatizes them independently of what they themselves might do. Or the reverse might happen. The provision of that graphic material might erode their sense of affect. They might become desensitized to it, and the society or the social groups they inhabit become desensitized to it. The point I want to make is not that these different effects are possible. The point I want to make is that the algorithm that feeds the content to those people only sees about them what those people have revealed through their internet behavior. And the privacy protections that we have prevent those algorithms from seeing any more. So what we have is a magnified effect and an attenuated ability to predict what that effect is. And so that is a failure of responsibility, it's a failure of agency. It's something I think that we need to worry about. But placing a duty of care on somebody who is in a position to see what's going on and to experiment with different ways of dealing with it is perhaps better than saying, this is what you should do, this is the material that you should screen out. We can see this also in the use of AI for automated content mediation. You've got to determine what is harmful speech, what should be prohibited speech online, but the ontologies with which we express this speech are continually changing. So you need to have something more than just a list of prohibited words. So I expect that by 2030, we'll be well ahead of that curve. And we will also have international collaboration, because law is a national thing. And these things that we're talking about are not national. They're not even bound up to individual cultures. But we will see more mutual recognition in free trade agreements and so on. Now, there's another thing which has to do with innovation. We heard earlier today about permissionless innovation. And if I do an innovation in a linear environment, I can row back from it if it turns out to be not so good. In a networked environment where people only see little parts of it, many things may be irreversible. And so the normal way the law operates by saying, you harmed me, therefore I'm going to come and punish you so that nobody else will harm me in that way, may no longer be effective. And we may need to have certain social conventions as to what is permissible and what is not. So some of the sweeping statements of rights and principles that we have today may have been somewhat rowed back from. Now, among the things that we will still be learning are that data are not reality. And they're not even models. And the things that we believe in may be more important in terms of what we do than the things that are actually true. Now, I'm not saying, I mean, the use of the word Trump there is incidental, but perhaps it's not. And I'm sure that during the discussion, we can talk about the role of truth and the role of speech as action, because these things will be important in the journey from now to 2030. We can hold people responsible for things. We can hold the FANG firms or the GAFA firms responsible for things, but if they can't comprehend what's going on and they can't control it, it may not be useful to do it. It may feel good because we've got the risks off our plate, but it doesn't produce movement towards a better outcome. I believe that we will discover, even in Europe, that data protection is not privacy, and that most of the things I worry about come from my freedom to act and to decide what I'm going to do. And that some of the things that we think are good, like data protection, privacy, trust, competition, efficiency, and growth, are not necessarily good in themselves. They're good because they lead to better lives. And as we become more digital in everything that we do, every sector of the economy will have a digital component that affects its business model, affects its relations with its suppliers and consumers, and affects its relations with regulators and governments. Governments will be using more reg tech as well. Everything will be digital to an extent, and that may expose to us the limitations of views that we have that are rooted in old technologies. Finally, we have this belief in accountability and transparency and explication. I just am here to say that being able to give an account of how an algorithm functions doesn't mean that you understand it, doesn't mean that you can understand what it does to you, let alone to the society that you're part of. These things, I think, will not be solved by then, and that's enough for me.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. A world that is unfolding and many lessons to be learned before we get there. Fortunately, we have 10 years. So, Jaya, can I ask you to come from your perspective?
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to do the magic clicking again. There we go. I'd like to ask you, what if? What if, by 2030, we had trust proven with consistency over time in all of our hardware and software? What if? What if we did that because we focused not on certification, which is a long and lengthy and painful and expensive process and will kill the majority of the startup culture and innovation that we're trying to achieve, but we didn't focus on that. We didn't focus on certification, but we got there because we focused on creating trust by trusting in the basis, but proving liability for the people who are responsible for their own security. So we focus on liability when they get it wrong, but we don't focus on a lengthy and complex certification process for getting it right. I'm just going to hold with that controversial statement for now. What if we had a trusted, global, secure routing resilience? What if we did actual adoption of routing protocols? What if we applied good manners, our PKI, and we could actually trust the traffic that we got from each other, from the global telecom space? What if we gave back control of identity and data traffic back to users? And what if we did that by saying it was non-negotiable to build or build out without having those premises built in place? So identity specifically back in the hands of the user to drive an entire data culture around the user. So fully user-centric identity. Again, GDPR is a great starting point, but there are mistakes that are made that have this sort of backlash. When I think about what we did to the Whois database because of GDPR, that's not the way we should be doing. So GDPR needs amending, and it needs building out for the points that are good within it, rather than just being an administrative exercise. What if we were ready for quantum computers, which we expect to get within the next decade by 2030, with more than a couple of thousand qubits? What if we knew what to do by actually already adopting some of the candidates of the NIST algorithm? We have a lower and lower set. We're already up to the second round of NIST. And what if we, when we finally had that by NIST in 2024, because we were already acclimated, because we already knew our crypto resources and assets, that we were ready to transition by 2030, so that when the quantum computer arrived, we were good to go because we still had a secure environment? What if when we talk about AI, that we actually focus on building these things out with a high degree of trust and transparency? And what if we always said that when it comes to critical application for AI, because it can do a lot of good, that we actually encouraged, fostered opening up of APIs in order to have that transparency in place? Hey guys, what if we just banned the selling of spyware? Not to regimes that we deem as legitimate or illegitimate, but we just stop selling spyware. David Kay, a guy at the UN, has already promoted this several times. I don't understand why we don't all agree there's no legitimate reason to be selling spyware. I'm just going to leave that with you for a second. What if we then also said that we do not trade in 0 days, especially when it comes from a black market? We do not hack back each other because it has issues on stability and resilience, and we condemn any cyberkinetic shift for hybrid warfare based on the Israeli attack of the Hamas cyber cell in a residential area. So we recognize that the collateral damage of hybrid warfare for civilian lives is too great a toll, and we do not want to see that shift from cyber to kinetic. What if we de-escalate all the things and try to promote a culture of peace? Because really, this I see as also non-negotiable if we actually want to achieve the greater technological goals, to explore other planets, to eventually get to a place where we can actually explore our universe. If we want to have a place where we want to cure cancer and all the other things, then we actually need to start by fixing the things that threaten that fundamental security and stability. 5 things, just 5 things in 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. What if we could spend all our efforts on doing in the interest of people, right? Beautiful. I love it. For the interaction of the audience, we have a little extra tool, and that is that we have, can you click for me?
Oh, yes.
We have this website where you can go to and answer this question. Take your time. While you're going to that website and answer this question, I'll hand over to Emily, who will introduce the other speakers of the panel, and we'll take them to a couple of questions, after which we'll come back to this. Emily? Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you, Jonathan and Jaya, for really kicking off the discussions with your imagined future in 2030. I'm very happy to be back at EuroDIG this year and to be introducing such a wonderful panel of speakers who are going to be reacting to what we've just heard. Let me just introduce the speakers. We have State Secretary Mattia Fantinati, who is the State Secretary of the Italian Ministry of Public Affairs. Yep. We have Henriette Esterhausen, who is formerly the CEO of the Association for Progressive Communications and is also a member of the Global Commission for the Security of Cyberspace, alongside our third panellist, Bill Woodcock, who's also Executive Director of the Packet Clearinghouse. So you'll see we have very subtly and cleverly replicated the multi-stakeholder environment with each of the panellists and speakers today. We've had Jonathan, I think you're academia and also tech, of course, Henriette from civil society, State Secretary Fantinati from the public affairs and government perspective, Bill from the technical community, and Jaya, who's technical and also from business. Yep. And so we have a full array of stakeholders here, but we also have you as the audience. Martin's going to be looking after the audience interaction. Please don't sit back. Interact, keep going to these questionnaires and allow us to react. So turning to the panel, we heard actually pretty hopeful futures from both of our speakers. We're hearing about a world where international cooperation is solved, that these laws are agreed on by all of the relevant stakeholders, where trust is endemic, people have control over their data, where there is liability, but also an environment where innovation is still fostered, where AI is done for the benefit of the community. So, State Secretary, is this a world, are these worlds that you would like to live in?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. This is a very good question. I'm Mattia Fantinati, the State Secretary of the Public Administration of the Italian government, and my key interest is to follow up the digital revolution that we are having in Italy. And my duty is to help Italy to have the benefit from the digital revolution. I would like to begin from your question and from your year 2030. I remember that I am a politician, and we used to be at the opposition, and we got prepared to try to be at the government, and we thought about this one rule. If you want to rule the future, the first thing that you have to do is to know it, is to design a scenario. Just because a couple of years ago, we commissioned our research to 11 professors, and we asked them, how will be our job in 2030? What does it mean? That I have to get prepared now. I have to write down the right law today to, in a sort of way, to regulate the work of tomorrow. And these 11 professors said a lot of things, but they agreed in two important things. The first thing is that the main aspect, the main game to be competitive in the next future is to be competitive in artificial intelligence and ICT sector. This is the first issue. And I mean, even our work of today, I think that if we think that in the next 10 years, our job is the same that we have today, maybe it's not like this.
Do you see, so how do you see, if take a seat, please.
Okay.
How do you see the role of government evolving? I mean, will national government still be relevant in this world that you heard from Jonathan Cave, where there's perfect international cooperation, where laws are agreed upon internationally? And do you believe it?
Yes, I think that the government is relevant because they have, of course, they can write down a law this is the main aspect. And it's really important because I'm speaking like a legislator. A lot of legislators, I think, and of course me as well, we do a big mistake, but in a good faith, that we try to write down the perfect law in the present. And sometimes when we agree to write down a law, a perfect law, in the meantime that we agree, the reality changes. So that's why the issue, and the important issue, has to have a long-term vision. And sometimes to have a long-term vision, it means to create a top-down strategy. Because when the government, when a nation, when the Europe, in sort of way, design a strategy for the next 10 years, it means that we have to cover in this strategy all the stations. And this is for digitalization, this is for safety, for healthy, and for whatever.
Thank you very much. Henriette Esterhausen, can I turn to you next? Do you feel warm and fuzzy listening to these two visions of 2030? And I'd particularly like you to address the perspective of coming from a developing environment. Does this ring true to you? Is this achievable for the environment in which you're operating and in which your stakeholders are?
No. I would start with no. And I would actually also respond to the idea of future-oriented policy. I think if you want your policy to endure and if you want to address the future, you need to consider the present and the past. And I felt that that was a little bit lacking in both scenarios. I saw no real acknowledgement of the inequality, social inequality, economic inequality, the massive and growing digital divide, particularly as we are moving towards new forms of data control and data management. And I saw a scenario where regulation is being imposed, which could, in fact, just consolidate the current status quo in the market structure, rather than open it up and make it more inclusive and diverse. So, yes, I'd like to think that or part of it could be achieved, but I was not convinced. And I think I also didn't hear enough about a global regime where human rights standards are respected across the board and where the rights of all people all over the world are considered. So, yes, in fact, it sounded a little bit scary to me, although I like the idea of trust very much. But I think you can only really achieve trust if you confront how little security and trust there is now, and in the fact that our business models, that's the other thing I didn't hear. I didn't really hear, I heard that we'll have better regulation, more regulation that protects people's identity and data, but I didn't see any real acknowledgement of the fact that the current business models that we are using as a basis of growing this economy have built in challenges, built in inequities. And then I had nothing about jobs. Nothing about work and the impact of increased digitization on the number of jobs and where the jobs are.
Thank you very much, Henriette. So I'm going to, before turning to you, Bill, I just want to come back to our speakers. You've been challenged. Good. From Henriette, let's hear your responses about how this world that you have sketched is relevant and achievable for today's digital have-nots. And let's hear about work, let's hear about the business models that we have today. And did you mean more regulation or did you mean better regulation? Jaya, can I come to you first and then you, Jonathan? Very quickly, because I want to come to Bill.
Emily, maybe it's good to look at the room because they had some opinion about it too.
Yes. Shall we, let's just hear from our speakers. I want to come to Bill, but please, if you are mulling a question, please come to the microphones, be heard, you're part of this conversation. Thank you. And yes, perhaps you can take us through the statistics when we've just heard from our panel. Thank you.
Yes.
Jaya.
So again, a little bit of caveat emptor. When you speak to a person who works in security, like me, we tend to be highly dystopic. So this is a huge stretch for me to sketch this positive vision of the future. But I absolutely do not refute the inequality that is there, nor do I not acknowledge the digital divide. In fact, for all of the issues that we mentioned, the greatest threat for example, quantum or AI or the insecure hardware and software will be the dumping grounds of the developing world. They will have the biggest degree of impact if we do not fix this now. When it comes to actually being in a position to verify that trust, because we all give it, but when it comes to verifying that trust, they are the least qualified and capable now of being able to do that. So we have created first world problems for countries that are absolutely not, having the first world infrastructure to be able to kind of digest how it is. And as for business models, that also is a place where, again, I see this as a dumping ground. Take a look at the technology that's available there. The only opportunity is potentially, if we have the right amount of exchange with those countries, that we allow them to leapfrog, that they don't go through the painful process that we've had, but because they don't have anything, are able to kind of jump ahead. And I think that's where the business discussion will play a huge role.
Thank you very much. A very brief response from you, Jonathan Cave, and then I'm going to come to Bill.
Okay, there are different ways we think about scenarios. One is a landing place scenario, and you reason backward from it. There's another one, which is a forecast method, where you reason forward and say what would be necessary to reach it. Now, certainly I'm not dismissing inequality, and in particular the different forms of inequality. We're not talking about income inequality. We're talking about profound differences, and what we know is that too little inequality and too much inequality are both stultifying and lead to a form of stasis. And we can see some of the effects of this in things like hikikomori, which we're seeing today, that too much equality of access to an unmediated social network space, too much connection to more people than we can cognitively deal with too many diverse and invisible agendas, will create certain things with which we will have to have dealt. Second thing is human rights. We're talking about a complex society. It has emergent behaviors. You can't necessarily reason up from the individuals to what the society as a whole does. And that emergence works in both directions. You can have irrational people who behave collectively as though they were rational, and you can have people who are perfectly rational and you put them in the wrong situation and they'll behave in very, very crazy or prejudicial ways, simply because you can't think through everything, and in fact it is impossible to know everything. And so on the future of work, I did want to comment on that because I don't think that the future of work is work. I think that the idea that we trade some part of ourselves for money which we use to buy goods is a model that we can no longer sustain. And I do hope that we've got past that. With some of the social economy and circular economy things, everybody has something to contribute. It doesn't need to be mediated through a supply of labor that immiserizes rather than enriches the people who do it. And finally, to answer your question, there is a strong distinction between more regulation and better regulation, or as we hear it in some countries, between better regulation and deregulation. Governance is the issue. Governance does not mean that there is a regulator or a government. It is a property of the system which allows the people in it to understand what they're doing and to link their choices to the outcomes they hope for.
Thank you very much. Bill Woodcock, thank you for your patience. Bill is the Executive Director of the Packet Clearing House and also on the Global Commission for Stability of Cyberspace. Bill, can I have your responses to the scenarios that you've heard and the discussions that you've heard, and particularly Jaya was a little bit critical of the GDPR, and maybe you can just have a riff on those ideas as well.
Yeah, sure. I think as a species and a society, we're facing two existential threats right now that are coming very, very quickly relative to our millions of years of evolution that are not preparing us for them. And the first one is the destruction of the environment that we have evolved to exist within. And the second one is a much more complex one, but I'll summarize it as saying the automation of exploitation of human psychological weakness at scale, right? So there are things that our brains do that are now relatively well understood that can be exploited by machines in vast quantity at very fast, right? And, we as sort of grown-ups in this space are existing in a window between the very young people who are easily exploited and very old people who are easily exploited. And that window is closing quickly, right? 3 or 4 years ago, this was not that big a worry, right? Now, people the ages of our children and our parents are relatively easily exploited. And in 3 or 4 more years, it will be difficult for us to escape AI calling us on the phone and telling us that there's a problem that we are very sympathetic to that desperately needs our attention and our wallets to be open. So I feel like as an industry, we're not particularly helping with the environment. Things like Bitcoin are a disaster, right? The environmental footprint of a Second Life avatar was more than the environmental footprint of a citizen of Brazil, right?
And one AI query is the same as 5 cars in their lifetime.
Yeah, so there's some real problems there. And on the other side, this is a problem entirely of our industry's creation, right? The Facebooks and Twitters and so forth of the world that are monetizing attention, this is a problem that we have created and we need to solve it. And 10 years is a relatively brief time to solve problems of these scale, yet it is the time frame in which they are becoming critical.
Thank you very much. Let's hear from the audience. Martin.
Yes, I'm trying to get the statistics of the question up. And let's see how this compares to
37% is the one we have to worry about.
what the panel has said. The audience thinks that over-regulation is a bigger threat than under-regulation.
Thank you.
However, the highest score is the unchecked power, the green bar in the middle of the corporate platforms, the big corporates. So how that compares to under-regulation, I'd love to know more. Fragmentation of the internet is relatively modest. It's the red one. The purple one is widening of social and digital device, as Henriette raised. And the black one, interesting that the system chose black. It's about mass digital surveillance. So you recognize this? Is there surprises here? I'd like to maybe 1 or 2 comments from the room and then back to the panel. So we got 2 people there. So please ask your first question. And then we'll take the second and then we'll go back to the panel.
To be honest, it wasn't really about this specific graph. Is that okay? Otherwise I can...
No, it's on the graph or a question to the panel. Please introduce yourself so we know.
My name is Ivo Hunink. I work for the city of The Hague here. And I actually have 2 questions. First from the lady from KPN. Sorry, don't remember your name.
Okay.
You talked about giving back data ownership, identity, digital identity. There's some things we are working on here in the city. It's very basic still. So I have my ideas on how we can do this, but I would like to hear from you. How do you think we should do that? And the second question for Bill in the end. You said Bitcoin is a disaster. From the environmental perspective, I understand your point. However, we are talking about digital cooperation here. And if you look at the crypto space, I think you actually will see that this is the first form of global, secure digital cooperation. And Bitcoin is just the first form of that. So I would ask you, do you see the crypto space as something positive in its essence, with many things to learn, or what else?
Thank you very much. Vittorio Bettola, another Italian in the audience.
Yeah, thank you. My comment is really actually about the graph. And since we have the Italian government, I'd actually like to make an example which also regards the Italian government. So, I mean, there's a big argument going on actually between the Italian government and the European Union on whether the Italian government can emit some bonds that seem to look a bit too much like currency. So, in the European Union, of course, says you cannot do that because that's, I mean, you already have the euro, you're not allowed. And then yesterday, Facebook comes and says, yeah, we created the new currency for the internet. So it's us and Visa and MasterCard, and this will be the new currency. And apparently, no one has a problem with that. So I think that all this discussion, I mean, don't we think that all this discussion are a bit moot if we cannot find a way to bring all these big foreign, by a European viewpoint, companies that are actually shaping the future into a bigger discussion and under check in a way. So this, I guess, is also what the graph wanted to say.
I think I got some interesting material for you in your panel.
Thank you very much. And for the audience, the next time we come out, I'd love some questions from the women in the audience as well as the men. Thank you. Can I turn to the panel? State Secretary Fantinati, can I start with you on the remarks made by Vittorio there about... and also your general reactions. We saw from the audience that they're more worried about unchecked corporate power than they are about over-regulation. So this is your moment as governments to get the regulation right. How are you going to do it?
Yes, it's a problem, I know that. We are against sort of too regulated and sometimes less regulated. So what I can say that it's about the situation of the Italian government now. This is slightly different from the other states. The problem is that we are a central government and we can take some decisions for the central and not for the local administration. And I'm talking just like Undersecretary of the Public Administration. My point of view is to reduce the threat in 2030. We have to reduce the digital divide, and not only for the people digital divide, but even the company digital divide, and even for the public administration digital divide. So there are several ways to do that. One that we are going to pursue, and I'm talking like Italian government, it's a bit different for some aspects. One is due to our constitution, because our local administration in Italy, and I mean region, and I mean province, are independent. So we can say, as a government, we want to digitalize all the Italy service, but it's just our thinking. It's not the way of our province, it's not the way of our regions. The main issue is the problem of interoperability between the data center, and so we come back to the security safe of the data centers. In Italy, we have more than 11,000 data centers. This is not the number that I'm afraid. Is that the data center, most of them, they don't talk each other. So we have a problem of interoperability. So sometimes, and I think to reduce the digital divide, you have to invest on education, in knowledge, and to think that what you are doing is for the health of the people. So it's sort of win-and-win strategy. It's not just a rule and you have to do in this way because I am the boss. It's just to try to say we are leading in a solution for the citizen and for the companies.
Thank you very much. Bill Woodcock, you had a couple of questions posed to you, and then I'm going to come back to the panel for other reactions. I'm glad that you mentioned the environment. That was on my tick list of things that I wanted to talk about today, so thank you for raising that. And of course, that naturally leads to discussions about cryptocurrencies and your response or your reaction to the announcement yesterday of Facebook and the Libra crypto. It's going to be solving us. Thank you.
So there is the problem of people using the phrase crypto, and traditionalists, yes.
See Jaya shuddering with this.
Knowing that what this means is cryptography.
Exactly.
As opposed to kids who read too much Ayn Rand and not enough Cory Doctorow who think it means cryptocurrency. So cryptocurrency, not inherently problematic. What is problematic is those kids who did not pay attention in high school economics and have a pre-Keynesian understanding of economics and think that proof of work has something to do with money. So the notion that digging a hole in the ground, extracting gold from it, digging another hole in the ground, putting the gold in that hole creates value is a medieval understanding of value, right? Post-Keynesian, we understand that currency needs to represent the sum of the work that's being done, not work destroyed. So the idea that you burn GPU cycles to create value is a false understanding, and we have used a vast amount of energy and resources chasing that false goal. So let's put that aside and look instead at cryptography. So cryptography per
Very
se,
briefly, Bill, because I want to get to the other panel.
yeah, is a really, really useful tool. It can be used to protect privacy. It can be used to assure trust. That's where our focus needs to be.
Jaya, there was a question to you, and particularly I think it resonating from the idea of giving back digital ownership. How? And these visionary statements about how wonderful the world is going to be, we're always light on the how we get there.
Yeah.
How do we get from where we are now, which is probably the opposite to that vision that you...
Well, again, there's that great quote that the thinking that got us here to the problems that we've got is not the same thinking we need in order to solve them. I think that is the premise. Fundamentally, right now, we are motivated. We have created the perverse incentivization to sell our data. The social media network that has the most identities, I won't name names, but the people who have the most identity, they see that as a cha-ching mechanism to then monetize that identity information to then do more targeted. We have so many identities, therefore we are the best place to do targeted advertising against those identities. We are the best place to, then sell the data from those identities to anyone else looking for it. So this is where I think we need to take a stand, and here is a perfect spot for regulation, because this was never the intent of the users. They did not go in with all eyes open and understand what was being done with their data. It was not made simple for them what it meant when they gave it away. So here I see that, again, I'm not a big fan of regulation. I believe, self-governance for a large extent when it comes to lots of things around the internet. But this particular evil needs this particular tool.
Well, it's like the remarks of Minister Kaiser earlier. It's self-regulate where possible and then legislate where necessary, perhaps. Yeah. Jonathan and Henriette, just very brief remarks for you, because we're after the halfway mark.
A couple of brief comments. First of all, on the thing about corporations and corporate powers, don't forget, we ceded power to these corporations in the first place. We walked into it with our eyes open. What we didn't think about were the consequences of the choices that we made. And that is true for the governments as well. When the governments try to permit innovation or change, it used to be that they fixed the things that needed fixing and got out of the way of the other stuff. Now they feel a degree of the precautionary principle, and unless they can have a degree of assurance and foresight, they won't permit businesses this power to regulate themselves. Second aspect of that has to do with the giving back data ownership. We're talking a lot about data subjects as though they were a natural right that they had. But that's not the society we're living in. What about the data objects? Your data are used to control my life. And there is no obvious virtue in giving you a control which is not only impossible for you to comprehend, but is burdensome for you to exercise. And so I think there's that. Then one final thing on the environment.
I'm just going to hold that thought, Jonathan, because I want to turn to Henriette first and then back to the audience through Martin. Thank you.
Yep.
I think that maybe what we should look at to bring all of this together is the user, people. How can you put people at the center of this? And I think we tend to talk about our current digital reality and the future one, assuming that it has its own trajectory, as if this online universe is evolving on its own terms. Jonathan, what about the textile industry? Yeah. The cost of clothing in Europe is cheaper than it has ever been. Why? Because of globalized labor inequalities. This is a reality. There's nothing, I think, in either your scenarios that suggest that that's not going to continue to be a reality. So, I mean, I think the business models need to be addressed, and I don't see in either of your scenarios actually how that is going to be really changed.
I'm just trying to cut in here. So we had 9 minutes.
Yeah,
Neither one of us were exhaustive.
I know.
I tried to keep it to 5 things. All right, so.
But no, that's good. But maybe you can
exhaustive.
address that. And I think what we need, aside from this sort of interoperability, I think we also need interoperable accountability frameworks. I think we need norms, we need standards. We don't just need regulation. And I think we need safety nets. I think if there's one thing that any kind of unpredictable future should come with is some safety nets. And I do think individual rights protections are a very important one.
Martin.
Well, our way to be comprehensive was getting you on the podium, not to give our scenario sketches all the time they could have otherwise. So for sure, we're moving towards, so what to do now for a healthy digital environment in 2030? And yes, we have a couple of options for you that we'd like to project. The next question to the audience, please. My clicker doesn't do it, so I hope. Can we have the second question to the audience, please? Okay. So what to do now for the healthy digital environment in 2030? The first is innovation first, EU digital agenda. The second is effective regulation of digital platforms. The third one is breaking up of the digital giants. We did that with AT&T, I think. The fourth one is ensuring infrastructure competition. And the fifth one is blocking access for bad actors, countries, whatever. So please take your time to answer these while Emily will take the panel to the next phase.
Thank you. Oh, can we have the
can we get
well?
the previous slide back that had the
It's Slido, right?
It's a new
It's a new
URL.
link.
It's not the same URL.
It's the menti.com.
Oh.
But I think that the code will be different for the question, right?
Oh, that's a disadvantage compared to Slido, where you just see questions.
So while we sort that out, I will use our precious moments to come back to our speakers and really ask you the same question. I'll start with you, Jonathan, because I cut you off.
Oh.
One thing, if you had just had one thing that we could do now that will get us to a better digital future, that would change our trajectory, and then maybe we could hear from that lady in the audience.
I don't recall the options that were on the table.
Well, you don't have to be guided.
Okay, but I will say one thing. We rely on the law because we rely on the law to be slow. And a system which has nominated parts of it that move slowly and other parts that move fast has a kind of coherence. The slow bits have the obligation to take what the fast bits into account. What Bill said about the environment reminded me of the fact that we are now living in a world in which the environment is moving at the same time scale as a lot of the things that we're doing. And we say that, and what I meant to say about foresight was that governments were content to set the ground rules for technological innovation if they thought it would move faster than law. But law is driven by public opinion, and that moves pretty darn fast.
Thank you very much. We've got the code. We have a lady wanting to ask a question. With your permission on the panel, I'd like to go to this audience member first.
Hi, thank you for the question. My name is Nelly Gowie. I work for the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs. I have a question for Jaya based on your introduction about certification and liability there. I agree that we need to use the entire toolbox to make hardware and software more secure over time, and that we need lots of things to do this, including liability. But I am curious. One of the things that you have with liability is that it's civil law, and that basically the framework that's in place now, it generally is, you could use it now, because if there's damages, you can sue. Granted, you could look at the question of damages in the cybersecure environment or insecurity, but the question is also to what extent would businesses be willing to sue their suppliers to apply liability, because that's something that government can do because it's civil law. So I'm curious to hear your reflections on that.
Jaya.
I am happy to sue. Let's start there. I'm thankfully not in charge of the legal department, but I think that here's the bottom line. When I try to take any new vendor, before we introduce them towards application of a service for our customers or use internally, we pen test it. And the amount of high severity vulnerabilities that we found in pretty much every single product that we buy from a vendor shows me one thing: they're not testing themselves, because they would have found it too. Because we're not talking about the stuff that would take us 6 months to discover. We're talking about a 2-week pen test. We find a CVSS score 10 vulnerabilities, not a couple either, and 0 days as well. And not only on regular products, but on security products, we find high severity vulnerabilities, 0 days. It's not acceptable. So I want liability, and you're right, the issue is what constitutes damage. If the presence of the vulnerability is there, I want the vendor to pay to fix or to remove the product from circulation until it's fixed. You know, we have to really rethink our thing, because again, what we see is the biggest vulnerabilities that we know about are still left unpatched all over the internet. Yep. So we need to come up with a better mechanism to encourage, motivate self-patching, automated, and fixing, and all propagated by the bloody creator of the hardware or software, the thing. Yeah.
Thank you. I can see you agreeing, Henriette.
Just to say, in fact, I agree, and Bill can elaborate on this. We are trying to, in the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, some of our norms precisely try to address that. Vulnerability equity processes, backdoors, hackbacks. So absolutely right. I think more accountability, and in some cases, more accountability requires liability. So I agree with you.
Bill, from the perspective of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, can you elaborate on those?
Yeah, as Henriette said, we have from our very blandest norm, which is the one promoting good cyber hygiene, all the way up through the ones that are aimed at keeping governments from attacking the private sector. We're looking at this question of vulnerabilities and how they are exploited or fixed. And I think obviously, one of the big questions there is vulnerability equities, where governments assert that they have a equitable right to keep vulnerabilities secret and exploit them rather than fixing them.
Thank you very much. Now, State Secretary Fantinati, you see, looking at the audience reactions, again, I think, first of all, just my personal observation, these responses probably would have been unthinkable about 5 years ago, that the most popular responses from a EuroDIG audience are that to do something now to get our healthy digital future is all about regulation. It's about effective regulation of the digital platforms, according to our audience, 35%, and breaking up the digital giants. Now, to just highlight the point made by Vittorio here, from the perspective of an Italian minister, state secretary, how do you go about getting that effective regulation against foreign companies?
It's quite difficult, because we know about the problems of a lot of web giants are creating on Italy. I'm not thinking about the tourism, or I think there's something else, because I say the tourism because the tourism in Italy is a very big market. Of course, we need an effective regulation of this sort of big platform that sort of we can say that the all big fives control everything. Yes, you said, but it's like that. About the government, I would like to introduce I would like to introduce something, because we wonder how to digitalize the system and not to be like another giant. Because for the government it's different. That's why in Italy we have decided to digitalize service. The citizen service must be at the center of the stage for the government action. So we want to digitalize the service for him, and not maybe the procedure of the digital administration. That is more hardful to do that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Jonathan Cave, and then perhaps we can take some more questions from the audience.
Okay.
Yes, please step up to the microphone if you have a question. We have still time for one or two. Jonathan?
Yep, I'll make sure that it's there. In relation to the vulnerabilities, something occurred to me. We had an earlier discussion yesterday about IoT and ethical standards in the IoT. One of the points that was made was that an awful lot of the players on whom we rely as a countervailing force against global corporate power and foreclosure of IP chains are SMEs, evanescent SMEs in remote jurisdictions that come and go and don't give a fig whether or not they are being sued. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is that the large firms do care about these liabilities, and they will bring their bit of the world into compliance. It will also magnify their market power in foreclosing those potentially rival market chains. So there's an issue there of confirming market power through what we do about that. The final thing I wanted to say about that, though, was that we also hear these large firms making entirely self-serving pleas for regulation along the lines of those two middle things. And I think we need to think very carefully about whether Mark Zuckerberg is asking for a safe harbor from liability and is asking for enhanced access to our data so that he can perform this public function on our behalf.
Thank you. I know that we've got burning responses from the panel, but I think let's take these questions and then you will definitely have an opportunity to comment.
Okay, we have 3 questions and time flies, so we'll keep it to this as well. Thank you for coming to the microphone. The gentleman in the back first, and then the lady in the back, and then the gentleman on the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Russ. I'm from Passport, and we are an industrial automation provider. There you have a lot of legacy systems, and those legacy systems cannot be patched. Also, I've been to a Microsoft seminar, and they say a shortfall of security professionals will be 3 million within the next 2 years. So if you want to patch, and if you want to have a lot of difficult systems in, I think the only way out is to make things less complex. What does the panel think of that?
Thank you very much, Peter. Can we hear from the lady behind you?
The lady? You get to, we'll take all 3 questions and then we'll go to the panel. Thank you for your excellent question.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Jessica Petrowski. I'm a professor at the University of Amsterdam. My question has to do, what I'm hearing is conversation about the environment, of course. But what I want to know is, what about the user side? What do you, when we're talking about what we should do now, thinking about 2030, I'm thinking about digital literacy. How do you respond to that? How do you think about, should we be playing a role from a government or public policy in thinking and supporting digital literacy?
Thank you.
Thank you. I think it links very well to what the other gentleman said about having the right skills, users and professionals. Please, gentlemen.
Hi, this is perfect also for my question. I'm Antonio. I come from the southwest of Spain, and I work with rural youth. And I kind of have the responsibility to send a message to those young people who live in very rural areas who already have the feeling that they don't have any opportunities for the future. And now we are talking about some scenarios, about topics that are already familiar to us, that jobs and regulations, but for them everything is new and there is not a reference to follow. So for those working in that field, I would like to ask the panel, what is the message we should send to those people that did live not that far, but actually quite far?
Thank you very much for those excellent questions. I saw Bill wanting to respond, and also Jaya.
Yeah, really quickly, the last 3 questions strike me as all being very closely related in a way that may not be apparent. The distinction between users and providers is a completely artificial one. We cannot proceed if we continue to honor that false distinction, right? We need users to be empowered to also provide services and goods in a digital economy. We can't say that there is one class of people who sell and another class of people who buy. That relates to the question of simplicity, right? If we assume that you have to have the complexity of a Facebook or a Microsoft or an Apple to be a provider, then we're reinforcing that distinction. If, on the other hand, we look at open source, we look at modularity, we look at small parts and pieces that form building blocks, each one of which is simple enough to be auditable by many people, That's how you build a secure environment. That's how people can take care of themselves. That's how people can create services to sell to each other.
Jaya, legacy systems, digital literacy, rural youth.
Okay, so again, I'm going to take from the last comment. So liability, we talked about only suing. I don't think that's the only way to get liability. If we still have those small products on the market, the issue is take them out of circulation. This is an economic issue, not a security one. If we take those products, like for example, consumer advocacy, we're talking about insecure IoT devices, the Kayla doll, you know, the one that does surveillance recording. Why is that thing still being sold? Because you can still find it. We should not be able to have those types of insecure devices even available. So that's
but
one.
It's the Bruce Schneier comment, isn't it? It's like I replace my smart thermostat approximately never. Once they're out in the wild, how do you get them back?
Well, that's a different story. That means some user already has it. I'm talking about the fact that these are still sellable. They are still on the market for sale, not they're already sold. So I'd like to take those insecure products out of circulation. When it comes to patching of OT, I feel your pain, but let's be clear, there's no such thing as is not able to be patched. What it is that there's usually hard-coded credentials embedded in software in a manufacturing process or a healthcare process, which requires additional certification to be able to operate as a hospital or a manufacturing plant. And when doing a patch, you potentially lose that overriding certification when you update these systems or change them out. So I think even here, we need to figure that one out. And the last one is, for education, look, in the Netherlands, there is a national free AI course in Dutch that you can download as an app. We need to look at those areas where we have that severe skill shortage, AI, cyber, quantum, whatever, all of these things, and we need to figure out how we can get to those vulnerable communities and educate them on the areas that we need educating in.
Thank you very much. I think that brings us to State Secretary Fantinati. We're in the final couple of minutes, so just very brief comments from our three remaining panellists, because then we're going to go to Stefania to summarise and wrap up. State Secretary.
Yes, I think there's a...
Rural youth, this must be a problem that Italy
sure,
has as
sure.
well.
Yeah, we got the same problem.
What is your message?
Because if you can think how the digitalization of a country is difficult, is in Italy we say that the digitalization in Italy is like the skin of a leopard. So it means there are several very good examples of the digitalization. We have cities that we have driverless cars, we are testing there, or a big data analysis, and other cities they are using paper.
Yeah, and particularly in the country. For young people, what is your message to the young people, the digital, the would-be digital youth who can't get online?
The message is just that I think that the state could provide the education of the young people. We know that education is a base. The digitalization, the safety of the data should be taught in the school. But because think, if I put on the charge my iPhone in a public administration computer just to charge it up, there's some data that can go to the public administration. So the security is something that's changing level that we have to learn about how to face it.
So security and education. Jonathan Cave, some final responses to these questions, and then I'm going to continue.
I really resonated with the idea of making the component systems less complex, which allows the complexity and self-organization of the whole system to operate, and that requires a different kind of expertise than patching expertise. And I think that we know a little bit about how that interoperability works. Digital literacy, most of the kids that I see are digitally literate in the sense of knowledge. The embedded values that went with that knowledge and the way in which they acquired that knowledge are much less understood, and we persist in trying to fit them into roles that existed in a prior economy. There's an enormous potential for doing things that can create value, even if they don't yet pay money, both among the young and among the underemployed people of more mature years. And if you put those two groups together who feel that dissatisfaction, they could actually come up with something. So in particular for the rural youth, at the moment, the only way they can escape is to come to the cities and to magnify the unsustainability of congested infrastructures. It should be inherent in what we do digitally that they don't need to do that. And some kind of provision, not just broadband provision, but empowerment to allow them to invent new things and do new things. If you look at what happens in Africa, where everyone has a mobile phone, they're doing things that we are only beginning to dream of.
Henriette Esterhausen, everyone has a mobile phone in Africa.
Not yet, particularly not smartphones. And in fact,
No.
current internet penetration and mobile penetration data is plateauing, even according to the GSMA Association. But just a response to the few questions. I think complexity, yes, and I think there's complexity at the policy level as well. Content regulation, for example, as David Kay has proposed, let's use international human rights standards, both to hold governments accountable for their content moderation policies and corporations. Digital literacy, I think, what does it mean? I think that we need to look at it as literacy or understanding of how the system works, how your data is used and abused. I think we need to look at digital literacy more than just building more consumers. We need to have people that interact with the system, that understand its risks and its potential more effectively. And I think in terms of the inclusion question, I think we need social policies that can ensure inclusion, not just digital policies, and they need to be integrated. And I think that should be the measure of how future-proof these policies actually are.
Thank you very much. There's so much more to discuss. I can feel that each one of our panellists is burning to make several more comments, which is great, but unfortunately we have totally run out of time. I'm going to pass the baton to Martin Botterman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily, very much panel and people in the room. In the tradition of EuroDIG, at the end of the session we have a short summary, and Stefanie Grotela over there has helped to prepare this text that you now see in front of you. And thanks to Rainer, it's even projected. So I saw him walk back with the slide. It's all real time. So a report will come back. The most important topics that were picked up for this time is that the current status is really featured by different degrees of extensive statements of rights and available legal tools. It's really about getting the principles right, understanding that there is a change of how we can make things happen and organize society, with a clear warning from the panel, questions from the room accompanying that, for digital divide, how do we preserve human rights, but also the need for skills and people to be informed. And clearly a wide concern about how the balance will be with large corporates and platforms doing a major role in society, whatever drives that, it has a major impact because people want it and follow it, and that's the services, maybe not what's beyond it. So going to the very last remarks on that, the excessive power and influence should be tackled, and effective regulation should be developed. How that looks like is something where people like Matja and Jonathan will work on directly, but they will need your voice in that. They will need your feedback. More than ever, regulation also needs to develop in a multi-stakeholder fashion. So thanks for practicing that. Please join me in thanking Emily and the panel for this excellent conversation. I'm just remarking that so far Dutch presence has been superseded by the Italian presence, by Matja, by the question from Vittorio, and by our supporters, Stefania, our reporter. So if you would be willing to leave the space, it's my honor and pleasure to propose to introduce the next speaker, Maria Gabriel, European Commissioner responsible for digital economy and society. Previously, she was a member of parliament, and she's been very active in areas as gender equality, civil liberties, and human rights. She is on her way, and I'll tell a little bit more about all her responsibilities. With Vice President Ansip, she's been a co-leader of the Digital Single Market strategy. The completion of the connected digital single market is very high on the agenda, and in that it's recognized that Europe needs to be more trusted and secure online to ensure that the EU is also a catalyst for public and private investment with a focus on high quality digital network infrastructure and with a keen eye to support the development of creative industries and successful European media. So to have this digital economy develop, Europe recognizes it's very much about successful European innovation stories. Have practice lead innovation in whatever way is possible. So with that, she's been setting an important skill. She's very clearly interested in subjects like equality, gender equality, human rights, and she's been a forefighter for that from her perspective of the country where she comes from, Bulgaria. And she would be very welcome to join us now. Is this an invitation to sing and dance?